comment. No comments were submitted. So it's just staff presentation and then discussion.
All right, thank you. So basically, I'm going to call the meeting to order and just turn it over to staff for updates on the city plan for information, and then we'll take questions from members of the commission.
Exactly.
Okay. Hope everybody had a good weekend.
Sure did, Charlie. I hope you did.
Too short. Same problem I have every weekend. Too short. Even if it's 3 days, it's still too short.
I hear you. I hear you.
Do we need, Chris, I don't know, it's a special meeting. We're not voting on anything. I don't know if we need to have a quorum. Do we need to have a quorum to call this to order?
I don't think that that's critical, but I mean, you might want to give it just a couple of minutes because it.
Yeah, because we got three. We need two more. So
up the cover.
Actually, we got four, so we just need one more.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull up the slides now. Just 1 second. You all see the seal and planning commission? Can you all see that? Yes?
Yeah, I do.
Cursor, my cursor is
No
moving.
quorum now, so.
You all see my cursor? Yes?
Yes, we see it.
Great.
I'm gonna wait one more minute and then we'll call it to order. I know we got 5, so we do have a quorum. We actually have 6, so that's good.
Good evening, everybody.
How are
Hello,
you?
everybody. Good evening, everybody.
Hope everybody had a good weekend.
Yes, too short.
There you go. That's what I said. I agree.
Charlie said the same thing.
What'd you say,
Sorry?
Charlie? What'd you say, Charlie?
I said I had the same thoughts. And it's beautiful out there today, so it's typical. The weekend is okay, but the prettiest day is Monday.
Never fails, never fails.
We're going to go ahead and, Chris, I think I'll go ahead and call the meeting to order. It's a couple of minutes after 4, and we do have 6 members of the commission or more here. I'd like to call this a special meeting of the Planning Commission for March the 22nd, Monday, March the 22nd, to order. This meeting is a special meeting. The only item on the agenda is to get updates from the city staff on the city plan. And I don't know that anybody, I think Chloe told me no one has signed up to speak, so that if any commission members have comments or thoughts, we'll take those after the presentations. Chris, who's going to I think commission members we have, just for the record, with us are Mr. Lassane, Ms. Harrison, Ms. Lymphosis, Ms. Bryant, and Ms., somebody else is here. Ms. Harrison, I think I said that. I think I said everybody, and myself. So we do have a quorum, and I'll turn it over to staff for whoever's going to present and for information.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chloe Stuber is going to kick us off with a little bit of background on our engagement calendar that's going to be coming up in reference to the plan. So I will turn it over to her.
Okay, Jim, can you, or
Oh, you
Christopher,
would-
can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, this is a very brief update. We've been giving you all more in-depth updates of engagement along the way. And the main update is that we've officially launched the spring engagement calendar. And so that's all online. If you go to charlestoncityplan.com/calendar, you can see all of the events, all of the public open to anybody, community events coming up through the end of April. Find details, locations, times. You can register if it's an online meeting. And so we have a lot up ahead of us. As Donna said, I don't know when we'll sleep, but we'll find time. We're mostly just excited to see what people have to say. And so it's going to be, we have an exciting 6 weeks up ahead of us. I don't know if we need to go into much more detail than that. Do commissioners have any questions about this particular part before we dive into the good stuff? All right.
If there's no questions, why don't we, all right, let's move forward.
Need to unmute myself. There we go. Okay, so we are going to run through some of the plan elements. This is certainly not the entire plan. This is certainly not every page of it. We're still working on lots and lots of it, but these are some of the key highlights and some of the key kind of decision points we think that are good for you all to see and be thinking about and give us comments on today. So I'm happy to be interrupted and also to bring in key elements of staff who've been working on different elements of the plan, because we have broken it up between our entire planning division so that we're all doing a share of it. And with that, I'm just going to start moving through. So population, of course, you can't do a plan without having a good sense of what your population is. The first hurdle we've got on this is that we have a delay with the census information. We are probably not going to be able to have census information in this plan for 2020 because it is not expected to be out till September now. That may even end up delaying or creating hurdles for the city with redistricting as well. You all may have seen some news stories on that, but unfortunately, the census info is not in. Now, the good thing is we've got a pretty good handle based on our internal estimates and the American Community Survey's estimates from 2019 that gives a good sense of what's going on, but it's not the complete report that we would have gotten had the census been complete on time. It's kind of, to be expected given that we were in the midst of a pandemic and it greatly impacted the census and their ability to do their job, but that is the kind of fact of life. Moving on from there.
Christopher,
yes.
real quick, is it just possible when that data comes in to add an addendum very easily to it, just to add it in?
It is. I don't know that there's that much it's going to change. I think we would be more interested in doing that if there were a lot of change from what we were expecting from our predictions and the American Community Survey. So we will see. And there are going to be some wild cards in the census info, such as how everything worked with students that are at college. Our downtown population has a very large percentage of students that are at the Citadel and the College of Charleston and MUSC, and we aren't completely sure about how that's going to be impacted. And it may be that our downtown population has a bigger drop than we're expecting. We're actually expecting it to go up a little bit, but with the way the census gets, finally enumerated, it may be that it goes down a little bit. So we'll watch it, and we certainly could add on if we need to.
Thank you.
So we thought this was important for everybody to see, and some of planning commissioners may have already seen this, and I think this is even on our webpage. But from 2010 to 2019, Charleston's gone up about 14%. A good bit of growth, but not nearly what we're seeing in Mount Pleasant or even North Charleston or Somerville or Goose Creek, or look at Hanahan, that's increased 50% in that same time period. So the metro area itself increased at 20%. So I know there's a lot of concern about how rapidly things are growing, but Charleston is growing less rapidly than some of those other places. And then how our population has changed with our density in the city. Of course, in 1920, we were much denser jurisdiction. We were somewhere in the neighborhood of 70,000 people in the city, and it consisted of just downtown. Now we have, according to our estimates, nearly 55,000 people, but we're spread over 5 distinct areas around the city and 133 or so square miles. So our density has gotten much lower. And it's important to understand that when we're planning the overall city plan. Economic development. Largest employers in the city, of course, the medical university, huge driver, Roper St. Francis. Between the medical university and Roper and the VA and the number of students that are over there, we're told that there are 22,000 people every day in the medical district. So one of the greatest concentrations of employment and people gathering in the Charleston region, if not the greatest. But medical university is definitely our largest employer in the city. And then largest employers in Charleston County, the Joint Base Charleston, which is 22,000. Of course, that's spread between the Air Force Base and the Naval Weapons area. And then medical university, as we've already stated, and the school district throughout the county. And then we've got 7,000 Boeing Company and 5,500 Roper. So anyway, give you a sense of where our jobs are coming from. And then to get you a sense of how growth has occurred in the regional job creation areas, food and culinary jobs are those that have grown the most. Not a big surprise. We might call these hospitality jobs to a degree, although they don't include the hotel aspect, but it's not a big surprise that Charleston is a big restaurant town, and we've seen a lot of growth in that area. And I'm happy to stop on any of these slides also if you've got more questions. I'm not going to mention every single stat that's on these slides, and we will put this slideshow up on the website ultimately too. So as we've been looking at our economic development situation in the plan, and again, the way economic development works in a comprehensive plan in Charleston is maybe not to as great an extent as it might work in some other areas, because the city doesn't do as much in the way of economic development. It's more helping the existing businesses. And so one of the things we are talking about is the idea of creating an actual office of economic development or manager of economic development in the current business and neighborhood services division of our department. And that could give us the ability to work to recruit some more in different employment areas, particularly for areas like, West Ashley, where we're really trying to create some more jobs, and in the tech sector. So it's something that we're thinking about and would love input on. We want to also create targeted goals for each area of the city and work with the corresponding economic development offices in Charleston and Berkeley counties. That's really where the real economic development comes out of, those county economic development offices. But anyway, do that to have a unified approach. We want to focus on transit-oriented business incentives for offset in parking and business fees or other fees associated with opening a business. And we want to research additional incentive options for small and local businesses to reduce overhead and leasing rates and allow for competition with larger national chains. So there will be more info in the economic development area, but that's just a snippet of some of the things that we think are key findings and key recommendations. So now moving on into natural resources. So citywide green space. This is a map that is very important to understand because what you see here in either, well, the water, obviously, but in the park area in dark green and the conserved lands in the medium green is the amount of land that is conserved via conservation easements or outright ownership by governmental entities, things like that. And there is a huge amount of it. And later on in the presentation, we'll talk about percentages of the city that are in conserved lands. But it's a very important thing to understand is that there already is a lot of conserved land. Do we need to do more? Absolutely. But we have a good head start on the amount of conserved land there is in the Charleston region or in the city of Charleston. This is information from Wagner and Ball that is very important when we're looking at where land uses would be and how we grow as a city to understand where the denser tree canopy is. And obviously it's less dense in areas of the greatest concentration of development. And, you know, there are a lot of things we can do to help mitigate that with redevelopment and with street trees, things like that. But there, you also get a sense of where the dense tree canopy is in areas that are experiencing new development and maybe some ways that we can help to protect some of that tree canopy in those certain areas. One thing that definitely comes to my mind always is the areas out here in the adjacent to the Francis Marion Forest that are in the Canehoy development that have some of the old growth Southern Maritime Forest out there. So something we want to keep working to preserve as much as possible of. And then our soil hydrological groups. The soils that are the better soils, we've talked about this in previous presentations, the greens, and the soils that are worse for building on and worse for water absorption, such as the group D soils, and then the kind of things that are in between that do some of the good things, but not all of the best soils. This gives you a sense of, again, where better development sites are, like along Clements Ferry Road, along Sam Rittenberg, medium level development sites, some of these Bees Ferry sites, and some of these things along Savannah Highway. And then where you're really getting into more problematic areas is where you have more of the pure pink group soils. Okay, next slide. So natural resources, some of the selected draft recommendations. Implement recommendations of the trees to offset water stormwater study, including updating the city's tree protection ordinance to preserve clusters of trees during the development process, to track and increase the tree canopy percentages around the city, and to prioritize underserved areas or areas with aging inventory for tree planting. Also, continue to promote natural resource planning and zoning policies that align with the living with water approach outlined in the Dutch dialogues. Including encouraging the use of green infrastructure such as bioswales, porous pavements, rain gardens, and wetland buffers. Also to plan and develop land use strategies to account for marsh migration due to sea level rise and the necessary wetland buffers associated with the new marshland. And then support land conservation efforts around the edges of the urban growth boundaries, specifically along Brownswood Road and Cane Slash and Plow Ground and the southern parts of Folly Road on James Island, as well as areas adjacent to the urban growth boundary in West Ashley and the Wando area and the Canehoy Peninsula. And then continue to provide and expand the parks system to include large and small parks and promote equitable access and safe alternatives to green space. And of course, there's a parks plan that is being worked on right now as well that will be doing just these very things as a part of its recommendations. So now into cultural resources. So one of the most exciting things I think we're doing in this plan is, for the first time ever, we are trying to map settlement communities in the city. And this is very important to understand how a lot of folks in the African-American community have lived in different parts of the city and areas of the city that have not really received the type of attention they should receive and the type of planning attention. And this is not going to be a plan that can look at all the details of how, you know, these areas evolve and grow or stay the same, but it is, at least for the first time, acknowledging where those locations are and what are some ways that we can identify them in the context of land use. Okay, Chloe, do you want to add anything about the settlement communities map? Have I given a good explanation on that?
Yeah, I think so. And just to narrate a little bit what you're looking at, sort of the differences and these, the way that the areas are denoted on the map currently. So you can see in the Wando area up on the Kenai Peninsula, those are more specific. That's because we have a final draft of those communities that have been vetted with community members. And so that we're able to be more specific with, whereas in the other areas of the city, those are still sort of works in progress and have not been fully vetted yet with community members. And then for Johns Island, we have contacts, but are still trying to, we're still working with the community members there to identify where in Johns Island. And so that process is still ongoing, and we haven't even identified sort of the loose areas yet. So that's why it just says to be determined, but that's all ongoing. And we wanted to include the TBD here to make sure that we're communicating that Johns Island will be included. That's just still a work in progress.
All right. So some of our draft recommendations in the cultural resources area are to build and maintain and preserve an array of first-class cultural facilities and sites. Of course, we're showing our new IAM, the International African American Museum, which is going to open soon, to support policies, incentives, and plans that stimulate historic preservation and the growth of cultural resources, with particular focus on those relating to African American heritage and history, to identify and protect those African American settlement communities, and encourage public and private investment in the growth and development of Charleston's arts community, and research ways to support African American houses of worship and congregations around the city, because you all have heard a lot about that, concerns about the departure of African American churches from downtown and what would happen to those structures if the congregations do move and things like that. So we are going to be working in more detail on the priority investment and community facilities elements. But those, the way planning works in Charleston, tend to be kind of making sure that we're working with the other jurisdictions such as Charleston County, Berkeley County, Town of James Island, and the city of North Charleston. And then community facilities typically are handled through our Parks Department, where our capital projects are, but we will be providing lists of what those projects are and the process that those projects go through and are going through in coming years, so that the plan includes information on them. But this is not necessarily a document based on the way Charleston works that is a huge part of that overall community facilities element. So moving into transportation. And again, we have a citywide transportation plan that will be wrapped into this document that was done a couple of years ago by our traffic and transportation folks and some consultants. But we will just give some updates on some of those projects and some of the overall transportation improvements that are coming, and some of the things that are really going to radically change our ability to get around our region. These are the future major transportation projects in the Charleston region. And these are all funded projects that will be happening depending on funding availability in some instances, but in most instances, they are fully funded. The one that we are still waiting to get a little bit more info on, of course, is 526, and what the full funding cost will be on that. But the other items that are shown on here have funding, such as the Low Country Rapid Transit, which comes in from North Charleston and the edge of Dorchester County, mostly down Rivers Avenue to King Street, and then crossing over to Meeting Street, coming down Meeting to Calhoun, taking a right onto Calhoun, and then a right onto Courtney, and then to B, and then to Lockwood, and around Fishburne and the West Edge area, and back out towards North Charleston again. So that is a super exciting facility that will be bus rapid transit, that will have the stations that are at the same level as the buses, so it's easy on, easy off, that will have a ticketing program that allows for quick stops, and we'll have a much more pleasant bus riding experience. Excuse me. And then major roadway projects that we've had from Charleston County, and they have some sales tax are identified here. And I'll go through the list on the next slide. And then, of course, Berkeley County and their improvements of Clements Ferry Road. So just as I've already said, the Low Country Rapid Transit, then the Glen McConnell Parkway widening, Mark Clark extension across James and Johns Island, Clements Ferry widening, Main Road Corridor Segment A from Savannah Highway to River Road, and Savannah Highway capacity improvement, which involves intersection improvements, US 17 corridor study, which looks at the Ashley River Bridge and the approaches to it, and then the Ashley River bicycle and pedestrian bridge, which is funded via federal grant. The Northern Pitchfork Road on Johns Island, which is being built through half-cent sales tax funds. The right-of-way has already been obtained and the design is done, and final details are being ironed out, and that should get under construction hopefully later this year. Central Park Road and Riverland Drive intersection improvements, which I believe the county has decided on the approach on that. The Folly Road bike and pedestrian improvements, including new sidewalks along Folly Road and protected bike lanes. And then Fort Johnson Road and Camp Road intersection improvements. And these are the Low Country Rapid Transit stations, such as in the Rosemont, Magnolia area, and then the Mount Pleasant Street area, the UG Street area, the Visitor Center area around John Street, the College of Charleston area around Calhoun and St. Philip and Cumming Street, MUSC along Calhoun Street, and the Medical District, also the Medical District on Courtney, and then the West Edge area there. Those are all the key stops of the Low Country Rapid Transit, and we are doing some pretty detailed study of those for transit-oriented development that will be allow for folks to not even have to own a car to be able to get around with that system. So we're very, very excited about that, and that will be one of the biggest transportation innovations we've had in this region ever. So huge aspect coming. So some of our selected draft recommendations are to continue to promote complete streets in our newer redesigned roadways for safe and alternative means of transportation, to continue to provide for improvements for bike and ped facilities, connect more shopping and job centers to neighborhoods with pedestrian pathways and multi-use pathways, and expand the bike system to connect West Ashley neighborhoods and parks with bike share. And I should point out here that when we come up with these draft recommendations, and again, we aren't showing you all the recommendations, there is a heavy emphasis on things we've heard from the community in these, from neighborhoods, from our surveys, from our community meetings. And there is a huge amount of interest in the community on sidewalks and the ability to walk and the ability to ride a bike. And, you know, that's not new for plans in Charleston, of course, but it really is coming to roost, I think, in this plan and in what we've heard over the last year as we've gotten ready for this plan. So that's why you're seeing so much emphasis on bike and other forms of transportation. Housing. So another key area of emphasis in this plan between housing and our overall living with water concepts, that is the real crux of this plan. So we're going to go in a little bit more detail here. So the average number of new units approved annually, this is some new data that is very interesting because everybody thinks of, you know, Charleston is growing so much faster than everywhere else. Well, actually, Greenville is growing even faster than we are, approving like 3.2, 3.3% of their existing housing stock every year in new housing. This is from 2014 to 2019. Durham, North Carolina, about 2.7%. Raleigh, North Carolina, about 1.8, 1.9. Charleston, we were in the kind of 1.8 to 1.7 range. Then bigger cities like Minneapolis, 1.6%, or Jacksonville, 1.5. So while we're growing pretty fast, we aren't growing as fast as everybody else. And even the people that we aren't growing as fast out as still are putting in a lot of new housing units. It's just what is happening in the American economy and with housing in our country. And our citywide housing stock by income, and you get a sense of the shortages we've got in these different categories. A pretty significant shortage with the folks who can afford only the 30% or less of the adjusted income, the minus 7,221 figure there, doing a little bit better in some of these other categories. And then, of course, when you get to the 100% AMI, you can see that the supply is doing very well. And when you get to the 120% AMI, doing very well. But then above 120%, we also have some shortages too. So we will go into more detail on these, but it points to some of these same issues we've been talking about not having enough affordable housing in the area and not having enough building stock in general in a lot of different categories. Why does housing affordability matter? Of course, you have displacement. If people can't afford to stay in their own neighborhood, their longtime neighborhood, you have people who end up becoming homeless because they can't afford housing. You have increased traffic because people can't afford to live in certain areas that they might work, and they have to drive further away, and that puts more people on the roads for longer distances. And then overall, for just the economic health of the community, you typically need to have more housing affordability. So when you look across the city at those who are making who need to not spend more than 30% of their income, which is essentially the way that the housing folks across the country say that, general barometer of housing is that you shouldn't spend more than 30% of a household's income. In Charleston, for folks who we want to not have to have spending more than 30% of their income to achieve this, citywide, we would have to have 16,000 units built. And this would be by 2030. And these are all throughout the community. It's not just a downtown issue, and it's not just a West Ashley issue. According to our assumptions and our data, 750 units would need to be built in the Cainhoy area. And these are affordable units. These are, the 30%, the 40%, up to 120% AMI. These are the more affordable and workforce units. On the Charleston Peninsula, we'd need 4,800 units. On James Island, we'd need 1,800, almost 1,900 units. On Johns Island, 2,500 units. And West Ashley, the greatest need of all, 6,300 units. So it's kind of a daunting number, but it points to the need throughout the city and in every development that we try to incorporate affordable housing. It may be difficult to reach this in the 10-year time period, but we should be doing everything we can to try to get to these levels. Some of our recommendations in the housing section are to strongly encourage a diversity of housing types within neighborhoods citywide, including attached style housing, townhouses, condominiums, flats, duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, that kind of missing middle that you hear a lot about. And allow by right in more base zoning districts, those types of housing. And strongly encourage development of housing in compatible mixed use and mixed income neighborhoods in close proximity to parks and bike and ped and public transit and the future low country rapid transit route. To expand development incentives for affordable housing development in more base zoning districts, including unit density bonuses, reduced setbacks and lot sizes, and reduced or eliminated parking minimums when located in proximity to public transit. And again, these are things that sometimes neighborhoods don't like and longtime residents don't like, but I think we're going to have to do some really dramatic things in our city if we're really going to get these types of numbers of affordable housing units built. We also need to adopt policies to increase housing security for existing residents in areas at risk of displacement, including policies tailored to preserving historic African-American settlement communities. And that's part of the reason that we're doing the extensive mapping project we're doing for those communities. Develop strategies for preserving and naturally occurring affordable housing through units throughout the city. Expand partnership with the Charleston Redevelopment Corporation to establish a land bank for future affordable housing development. Implement policies that reduce regulatory barriers that add time and cost to affordable housing developments, including expedited review and permitting, which we constantly work to expand and speed these up, but there still is more work to be done. Reduce fees, affordable material standards, and a full-time staff member devoted to shepherding projects through the development process. Allow more flexibility for building design and architectural standards where appropriate. And that's a fine line in a community like Charleston, but just continued look at the design of these new structures for affordable housing to see ways that we can make them as cost effective as possible. Allocate dedicated resources and staff to assist lower income homeowners in maintaining their historic homes. Create more funding streams for affordable housing development through zoning and other planning tools. Update the zoning ordinance to apply conservation design principles to all new and infill housing developments. That new ordinance that we looked at your last meeting, how can we apply those principles overall in new zoning in the city to make the best use of the highest land in the city, and to also make sure that we get good mix of housing affordability in the new developments. Continue to leverage funding opportunities for affordable housing at the state and federal level, and advocate for legislation that can be used to fund or incentivize affordable housing, and to continue to fully implement the recommendations of the Housing for a Fairer Charleston report, which a lot of our housing planning has been based on. So now into the area that probably most people look to a land use plan and comprehensive plan for, what it actually calls for on the ground in the land use. And of course, water is first in all this. And we have followed the Dutch Dialogues principles, and of course, Ed Wagner and Ball help us tremendously with this. This map you all have seen before, but it shows the area that have the greatest tidal flood risk, that have the compounded risk of tidal floods and on the ground existing stormwater flood issues, areas that we need to adapt so that development can better approach the threats it's going to have, and then the areas that are really high ground and probably some of the better locations for development. Cainhoy Peninsula, of course, stands out. The ridges that are up there along Upper Clements Ferry Road. Johns Island, Maybank Highway stands out. Sam Rittenberg in West Ashley stands out. And then, of course, other areas that in some instances are beyond the urban growth boundary, but are outside utility service areas. And then this somewhat complicated map, but it's very important to understanding our overall water situation, where we're losing wetlands, where we're going to be gaining more areas of wetlands because of marsh migration, and factoring in essentially 3 feet of sea level rise, which is what the city is trying to do in all our planning efforts. And that all our marsh migration maps that ultimately colored our land use maps are based on this marsh migration figure that is based on the best available science and data from a number of different agencies and entities. So in our land use recommendations, we're trying to make the best use of high land around the city for residential, commercial, and mixed use development, especially areas around current or future public transit corridors. So those are the areas that we're really trying to do as great a job as we possibly can to make the best use of those parcels. We also want to reduce densities on lower ground and eliminate development in future marsh migration areas. We want to adapt and defend structures currently in those areas wherever feasible. We want to have strategies for middle ground our strategies for middle ground require additional study. These are very much related to the stormwater issues in those areas. We're going to need to have analysis of individual drainage basins and stormwater easements to get a complete sense when you're in those kind of in-between areas of exactly what level of density can be tolerated in a particular area. The stormwater folks have done a huge amount in looking at the troubled areas, and we're doing a lot of work with other jurisdictions to try to come up with some fixes for some of those troubled areas and get new easements and get new drainage improvements that help with those. But we're going to need to continue on that, and any new development is going to need to take some of that into account. And we also want to underscore the responsibility of effective water management on higher ground of the city to better protect the middle and lower grounds downstream. So even though we might have areas where we're encouraging more land use on in higher ground areas, we still want to make sure that there are good areas of pervious paving and green roofs and things like that, that make sure that we don't end up flooding folks that are further downstream and at lower elevations. So we want to develop in proximity to, we want to make sure that development in proximity to African-American settlement communities it complements the existing layouts and development patterns. We want to increase residential density and develop TOD strategies along the future low country rapid transit route. We want to create in-town job centers along key transit corridors. encourage use of green stormwater infrastructure, including clusters of trees, use of pervious surfaces and green roofs. We want to continue to use the urban growth boundary to surround the city with strictly rural development outside the UGB and lower suburban densities along the inside edges of the UGB. So our overall density categories and plan categories start with the rural category, which is 0 to 1 units an acre in the area outside the UGB. Our suburban edge, which backs up to the UGB, typically is 0 to 4. That's 0 to 4 units an acre. We'd call that in the past. You're going to see the differences in the new plan versus the old. The previous plan names are in the area in white on this chart, and then the new names are in the areas in gray. We have consolidated some of these mini districts we had in the previous plan into just a few of these. And again, this is not zoning. These are just land use categories with recommendations for the future. We will build new zoning off these categories that may have more districts than we're just identifying here. This is just a way to better plan in a 30,000 foot context. We have done away with the highway district that we had in the previous plan and combined it into the neighborhood edge area, because really highways tend to be in Charleston. Once you're inside the UGB, they tend to be at the edge of neighborhoods. And so how we treat those edges of neighborhoods is very important. And just designating it all to highway uses is not necessarily the best approach in the future. We have renamed our urban core to our city center, which we thought better reflected the fact that we've got multiple centers around our city that we'll be showing you on some of these maps in just a minute. We've kept our same campus designation for colleges, schools, hospitals, institutions, our job center areas for high concentrations of employment, our industrial we've kept, and this is both light industrial and heavy industrial. Parks, self-explanatory, and then our low impact and conserved areas. This is going to have some new effect because this is areas that could be impacted by the sea level rise and the impact of water. And then we have, of course, our natural and wetland areas as we previously had. So looking into downtown, this is the first time you all are seeing these, and we've got our new color schemes going here. So I'm going to kind of identify a few things. And again, I'm happy to spend much more time on these. I'm going to flip through these quickly, but happy to go into more detail. But we've kind of shifted the city center up a little bit. We've taken it away from Broad Street because Broad Street isn't as intense as some other areas on the peninsula. We've shifted it up from Market going north on King and Meeting, also including Union Pier and some of the waterfront area that ultimately would be redeveloped. And then getting into areas that have higher ground and the proximity to the Low Country Rapid Transit, as well as also the Low Country Low Line. We've shifted some areas and included them in this city center as you get to Upper King, Upper Meeting. Of course, the Upper Morrison or the UP area of the city is in this zone as well, always has been. Laurel Island is in this zone because of the PUD that has been approved for that area. Magnolia is in this zone. And then you get into some of the areas. This is where our hub of Low Country Rapid Transit is, right around the intersection of Mount Pleasant Street and Meeting and King and Morrison, and then on up into the neck until we get impacted by where future rail will come through. And we're kind of cutting off some of the density at that point and keeping the industrial that's in place up in that area. Campus locations that you all are very familiar with, from College of Charleston, Medical District, and we have made Medical District rather than an urban core. We've transferred that to a campus district because it really functions better or more in keeping with the campus district than it does in the urban core. The Citadel, Burke High School campus, all our high schools are in campus layouts as well. So we can come back to it, but I'm going to move on. All right, so Inner West Ashley, and we have looked to try to create more potential for density along Sam Rittenberg, where we've got higher land and access to transit. And this also morphs over to Citadel Mall, where while we do have some areas of marsh migration and that kind of low impact and conserved area on the Citadel Mall property, the bulk of it was filled a long time ago and is good highland. We want to work with the redevelopment team for Citadel Mall and make sure that they do as much as they can on that highland with the stormwater that's coming off the facility. But it is a good place as far as elevations and access to transit and centrality to our population, that it could be a good city center. The medical campus around Tecklenburg Drive out here around the hospital still is showing as campus. And we've got our parks and conserved lands, and of course, the low impact and conserved areas that do morph into some areas in West Ashley where the elevations are just lower. You get up into some Burns Downs areas here, some of the Confederate Circle area, and some of the other neighborhoods that are along the creeks here. And these are areas where we're going to have to work to defend and adapt and, work with, make the best use of the stormwater that we have there. But it's probably areas that we should not be recommending greater densities in anymore. And so that is being identified here. And that's probably one of the biggest changes, is that we do have this now. This is the beginning of what we might call elevation-based land use recommendations, or one day elevation-based zoning, which we've heard lots of folks, calling for because of Charleston's struggles with water.
Christopher, quickly, on this map,
Donna, you have a question?
the lightest shade of salmon is suburban edge. Am I translating that with a legend correctly? Because it looks kind of rural, and that's why I'm asking on my computer. And I just want to make sure.
Edge is yes, and I don't know that we've got any suburban edge on this image, and we definitely don't have any rural, because this is all inside the UGB.
Okay, it just looks so light color that it was confusing that it may just be my image on my computer. So you're saying you don't have any suburban edge on here? You just have suburban and neighborhood?
This area of West Ashley, we've got any suburban edge? I don't think we do. I'll need to double check that.
So the color that would be on the south side of Savannah Highway, matching your legend, would be suburban. Is that the way I'm reading this?
So this is suburban, yes. And through here,
Okay.
suburban, yes.
Okay, so but see, that other color on this side, on the south side, looks lighter than that color that you just showed me. That's why I'm asking.
And these are like hot off the press. And
Christopher,
any
we
staff-
are still working through this, and we have broken the rural, suburban edge and suburban onto their own categories that are going to be a different color shade altogether, Ms. Jacobs.
Okay.
For this very reason, we noticed that as well, that
some refinement to do on that, yeah.
That's fine. I just want to make sure, because it looks slightly confusing on this map. Thank you.
Some other items of note here, we've already got our job center that is DuPont, Wapu area that we already have a plan for and all that. But we have designated to job center the auto mile of Savannah Highway. And I'll tell you kind of why we did that, because it is a huge job generator, several thousand jobs, all good paying jobs in that area, that we feel like, originally that had been a highway designation, and it's not like we're trying to encourage more automotive uses, but we also felt like, because of those that are there at present, it is an important part of our jobs in the community, and we should help to try to protect that as a job center. So there may be a good bit of discussion about that, but that is something that is new here. Again, the highway designation, which used to be all up and down Savannah Highway, is changed to be mostly like neighborhood edge, which we have in the like in the Avondale area and along Savannah Highway Farm Field, and going there and heading up to Citadel Mall, and then along some of Sam Rittenberg is neighborhood edge, school campuses and things like this. But then we move into the city center at Sam Britt and Ashley River Road there, and also at Sam Ritt and Old Town Drive in the Ashland Landing area. And then you go out 61, we go to neighborhood edge along these areas that used to be highway there. So we feel like that is a better way to treat those neighborhoods without the auto intensive things, but still providing different goods and services, and maybe some density along those corridors that could have some bus service as well. Okay, we go on outer West Ashley here, and neighborhood edge around West Ashley Circle. The only real city center is back here at Citadel Mall, but the neighborhood edge here would be pretty significant over time. And then also have some neighborhood edge at East Ferry and 61. Then industrial such as the landfill. And we've gotten away from much of the industrial out here because it's just really not developing that way. You'll also notice that the low impact and conserved, moves into some of these areas as well. And we've got to be very careful with that. It moves into the outer edges of the West Ashley Circle here. It moves into the Hickory Farms neighborhood here. So taking care to defend and adapt some of those areas, but not allow for greater density in those areas either. Going to move on to another area of the city. So now we'll move to James Island, where we are looking at showing some city center along Maybank because it's such highland. And again, some of our criteria for adding city center was availability of future transit and being high, some of the highest lands in the city. And so we did put a little bit of city center along areas of Maybank Highway where there could be some redevelopment there. Obviously, we have overlays that are working on in that area too. So how we work out those juxtapositions remains to be seen. We are looking at neighborhood edge for the bulk of Folly Road in the northern areas of Folly Road, because we do see this as a future bus rapid transit. It's not something that's funded like the low country rapid transit that comes into downtown, but it is something with the success of that route that could become something in the future. We have a lot more on James Island, suburban edge based on the densities that prevail at present. We also have a tremendous amount of conserved lands out here, park areas, conserved lands, golf course. So a lot more green on James Island than some other areas. We classified Bishop Gadsden as a campus area, and it's grown a good bit further over here. James Island Charter High School is a campus area, and also the First Baptist High School is a campus area there. So, and a little bit in Signal Point.
Excuse me. Why wouldn't you consider Fort Johnson a campus area as opposed to a job center? Because the college is out there, and it's a state agency. Looks like you have Fort Johnson, or maybe I'm looking at this wrong.
It's more about the jobs than,
okay.
Like campuses are more, there's a educational thing going on, or it is, it doesn't fit in a regular neighborhood standpoint like Bishop Gadsden. So that's why that's a campus. But Fort Johnson is definitely a huge job generator. Hundreds of jobs are out there.
It is, but we're affiliated with, the College of Charleston, the Medical University, a lot of agencies. I don't know what the subtle differences is there. It's just a question.
It's a good point. It's a good point. I didn't think about those affiliations.
Yeah, there are a lot of different affiliations out there. And I know, the marine sciences from the colleges out there. MUSC has a huge engagement out there, or did, at one time. NOAA is out there. I'm just wondering, I don't know what the subtleties would be of zoning in the future, but I just think it might be a consideration for discussion.
Okay. And you'll notice we did have a little inset here, and this is for this area along Lower Folly that you may have heard me talk about in the past. And it's actually outside the UGB for the city. It's not outside the UGB for the county. And it actually has zoning in place all through here that is much denser than we would ever allow outside the UGB. So for consistency's sake, we threw this in to let you all and council discuss. If y'all don't want to see fit to make a change to the UGB there, then that's fine. But really, the comprehensive plan process is the right time to look at the UGB. And so this is the only area in the entire UGB around the city that we thought there might need to be any kind of change in. Should this be an area that you all do recommend for a change, what we're showing is just the frontage along Folly Road being added in. We already have a lot of this area that's already developed, such as the Spyglass, such as Ocean Neighbors. We do have some marsh migration through here, shown in this area. So this would be less development in those areas. There's a large church site, for example, over here that, has not been developed, and I'm not exactly sure, what that church has plans to do, but it's a huge area of marsh migration right there. So not a huge change, but it could be one that just might help even the lines up and make them reflect true zoning that's on the ground and true development that's on the ground. So, okay, moving on to Johns Island. And this, again, the emphasis on Maybank and the 3 centers along Maybank. We ended up with these as city centers. These would not be as dense as a city center you might see in the middle of downtown or even at Citadel Mall, but still for Johns Island, these 3 centers are the centers, and these are areas that do have higher elevation, so it's appropriate to have this denser development there. Also, this is the main transit route that would be on Johns Island, being Maybank Highway, and it is connected to the other parts of Johns Island pretty well, so that's why we included that. Then we've got some neighborhood edge along Maybank, and then we move into more suburban. And then as you get to the outer edges of the UGB, we move to suburban edge. And then of course, outside the UGB is all rural. Even the Rawl and Woodale property over here meets this rural category because it's all no more than 1 unit in an acre. Then we've got some areas like River Run is in here where we've got a good bit of marsh migration. So should, some new proposals come in that area, we would have to evaluate it from that standpoint that we've got marsh migration moving through there. We've got the airport that has always been kind of designated as a job center. We don't have a lot of jobs out there at present, but it is industrially zoned land that could be that in the future, but got to be careful about these marsh areas and marsh migration areas there. So that is Johns Island, not that radically different from what you might have seen before. And then lower Cainhoy Peninsula, Daniel Island, which this is basically all built out. We did now designate Daniel Island Town Center as a city center because essentially it's been built that way. We have a lot of job center there with a lot of office and tech employment out here. And so those are designated that way. And then suburban type densities within Daniel Island itself. And then we get a lot of marsh migration over in here, particularly along Lower Clements Ferry, St. Thomas Island Road, areas that will be problematic. And Chloe, this is the first time I'm seeing these designations, but I believe these markings are the areas of former settlement communities, correct?
Existing.
I mean, yes, existing, yes. And so some of these have had new development in them and some of them have not. So this gives you a sense of how settlement communities will be identified and the prevalence of them along areas like Clements Ferry. So then we will zip up to the next part of Clements Ferry, the upper parts. So this is the Jack Primus area, again, a settlement area, Charleston Regional Business Park, which is showing as, of course, job center. Then we have shifted from highway to more of a neighborhood edge along Clements Ferry, and even some city center in some areas where, because of the highland, because of the potential for good bus transit in the future out here, we probably should be seeing greater densities along these portions of Clements Ferry. For instance, in the Cainhoy development, Point Hope, trying to get as much density within a 5-minute walk or so of Clements Ferry where you could have transit and where your elevations are highest, and diminishing densities as you get further away from Clements Ferry. And I know some of our advocacy organizations in the area, the Coastal Conservation League, for example, have been advocating for that kind of an approach with the Cainhoy development itself. Not, changing the units that could be built there, just trying to encourage the greater densities along Clements Ferry itself. Also, a good bit of job center, the Gildan area, Charleston Regional, and other employers that are in these areas further down Clements Ferry Road. So we are also in progress on our resilience element, and these elements are going to be, this element is going to be interwoven throughout the plan document. So we're going to kind of sum up our whole plan when we get to our resilience element. So we don't have more on that for you here, but I think what you're seeing in all the land use and all our housing and all our transportation is a city that is seeking to become much more resilient and deal with the pending threats that we have from water and economics and just the general growth we have in our region. I'm happy to answer other questions. How long have I gone here? About 45 minutes or so, something like that. It is at 5 o'clock, but let's hear what you all think about all these things.
Commission members, you have questions? First of all, Chris, thanks. It's a lot of information to digest, and y'all did a lot of work compiling all this stuff, so we certainly appreciate it. And commission members, questions, comments?
I have a question and a comment. The first question is related to the settlement communities that I'm so happy to see that those are being identified and recognized in the plan. And it sounds to me as if this is sort of a preliminary step in planning for these communities. What would be the subsequent steps beyond the comp plan that might assist those communities?
Sure. So we wanted to identify these first and foremost because they hadn't been identified before, and we will have the actual names that people refer to these areas as well. And then we wanted to, understand that different folks in these areas want different things. Some settlement communities, would like to be left alone and have everything stay exactly the same as it is. Some might want to sell some land and have redevelopment occur in the area. So we want to make sure that if there is redevelopment, that it follows, the land use recommendations we have in these areas, and that it's done in the context of understanding that there is a settlement area there. It could be that over time we do much more refined neighborhood level planning for these settlement areas, but we can't do all that right now. There are too many of them. It's too much of an area around the city, but it is important that we at least identify them and say, okay, if we're going to have a land use change in, let's say, this area along Pineland Road, well, what is the context and what is the impact to the remaining settlement area if we have that land use change? And let's get in touch with some folks that live in the settlement area and have them part of that dialogue, which is not really something that's necessarily happened before.
Thanks. Yeah, I wanted to sort of put a stake in the ground on that so that doesn't get lost after the comp plan is adopted, that there's more planning work to be done here. And I hope and expect that will happen. And then the comment was more, this is very mundane, but re-looking at the colors on this map.
Okay.
And I know Mr. Pullman mentioned that y'all were doing that. Having to continually refer back to the legend and say, well, is that, what the gradations of that color? It's tough. And so anyway, I would recommend another look at that.
Yeah. I think we're getting some similarities. We've been working to try to get them as different as they could be, get a little bit more yellow in some of these. And I think we're definitely going to need that to differentiate between suburban and neighborhood and suburban edge. So, yeah.
We're on version 3 of the color scheme and are still going back and forth. So I think you're seeing version 1. So we're definitely going to make sure that we can differentiate between the categories because we've been having the same troubles.
So
I guess still a work in progress.
Absolutely.
I would just say beyond the color, and that's not silly because it's important that we all be able to read it, but the work that's been done here is really impressive, and I compliment the staff for what's happened here. I mean, we will probably be nipping around the edges of this, but boy, this is really impressive. So thank you.
Other comments or questions? Donna, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to also thank the staff because I've been working with them on some of these issues, and they're really burning the candles at more than 2 ends. I don't know where all the wicks are going, but they're burning. And I'm really grateful to Mr. Lassane that he noticed all the hard work on the settlement community because I've been in there on the ground with staff on this, and it's been really exciting to get down and work on this. The one thing I noticed that we might want to add is there was no mention of the African-American cemeteries. And I know that there was some work in there that, because so many of those are not identified, and truthfully, development on top of cemeteries has been problematic, as we've seen. So I think we just need to make sure that that's included in the verbiage, not just the community, but also the potential for cemetery work in there. I have just a few random thoughts. I remember during community engagement, and I would like to add here that during community engagement, the staff and our consultants worked very hard to make sure that there was a huge diversity of people at the table, to make sure that all the different kinds of voices were heard. And even at the neighborhood leaders meeting that was last week, there were some compliments to staff that they got their voice heard in the first time for a long time. So that's, I really highly commend that work. But one thing with the, from the James Island group is there's some really concern about the movement of that urban growth boundary. So I would walk that path very gently and get back to James Island. They have some real concerns about the movement of that urban growth boundary, as well as in other parts of the city. I think a lot of people want us to draw a hard line in the sand. I don't know about that, but I just heard that a lot as we went along. I heard it under land use about what I'm going to call a concierge staff person. This came up during Plan West Ashley, for somebody there to kind of hold people's hands, because the one thing we can do is give people time to, and that's money in some of these things. And but I didn't hear the same thing with economic development. And it might be, I know there was a staff person to encourage it, but sometimes people also just need their hand held so they can get their jobs out there. And one thing that came up in some discussion was what I'm going to call affordable commercial space. We talk a lot about affordable housing, but some of these small businesses, they just can't find affordable commercial space. And I know that Greenville did some work with this on that downtown redevelopment, and along that Swamp Rabbit Trail, I think it's called. They did some very creative things there for affordable commercial space. Just putting that idea out there. The other thing, well, there are a couple other things. I'm looking through my notes, and I'm sorry, they're awfully random. In your housing, I think that one thing that's really important is that we really look at the ability to give a diversity of housing. We've talked about this a lot with Planning Commission, like accelerated dwelling units or small houses or, duplexes. I think we need to really educate the public about this. What planners have taught me about the missing middle, I think will become really important here that we think about and look at. And that can get involved in that housing element, as well as zoning changes that accommodate that, because people get really nervous with the density thing. But another educational opportunity that was afforded to me was this thing called Guess the Density. It was a little video where you got out there and you were shown densities, and then you had to guess what the density was. And most people were wrong because they see density as big, huge apartment complex, and not maybe something like Windermere, where there are duplexes and triplexes in the old neighbor of Windermere, and people see that as a single family residential neighborhood. So I think that educational opportunities we can use in the development of this city plan. And I think those were all my random comments, except to ask if these slides could be put in our Dropbox too, because there was a tremendous amount of great information to digest, and I appreciate all the effort. Thank you.
I think, Ms. Lampus, you had something?
Yes, Charlie. In reference to the housing and the development land, I think it's critical that if you're going to have anything in the affordable range, especially with housing and the cost of materials these days, that you have to get the approval processes to get much better than they are now. As I've mentioned before, y'all have heard me say it, there's very few people that want to do anything in the city of Charleston anymore because of the time frame that it takes to get things done. And if you're going to really take the opportunity to get some affordable housing in there, you really, and workforce housing, you really have to improve on, and really development. Because if you don't have a development that could actually house affordable and workforce housing, then it's all kind of a moot point. So I think you really have to look at and be very specific about incentives that you mentioned in your earlier slide, bonuses for density, but you got to add time frame in there, and you've got to really make sure that because as you know, time is money, and if the more time that it takes, the more expensive it's going to get, and we will never achieve affordable or workforce housing unless we do that.
Thank you, Sunday. Good thoughts. Other commission members, comments, questions?
Mr. Lassane has his hand up.
Ms. Harrison, you've been kind of quiet. I'm worried about that.
No, I mean, I think I've got some more questions that I think I probably just want to send over to staff just on just some of the formula and how they derive the numbers for how many they think we need in the downtown area. I've been contemplating how that number was contemplated.
I see Mr. Lassane's hand is up.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Lassane, you go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to, I actually wrote this down, and Ms. Jacobs mentioned it, the issue of the urban growth boundary on James Island. And I maybe this isn't the proper forum to talk about it, but I mean, it seems to me that to some degree, what was shown here on that map was more about recognizing what's actually on the ground than what would guide future zoning or planning decisions. And you kind of go back and forth in your mind about whether the map should either recognize the reality of what's on the ground or recognize, put forth some aspirational thought about, if you could turn back the clock, what would you do with that site? The fact is those sites are quite suburban now, and you wouldn't call Ocean Neighbors rural. And so, nor would you call the Spyglass Apartments rural. So I know that there might be some angst and so forth on James Island about that. And it may not even be worth the brain damage that it would, be to change that map. But it does seem to me like what was proposed here was no big change for the city's approach to land use there. It's simply recognizing what's on the ground.
And I think that it's important for consistency of the urban growth boundary. So we can always say everything inside the urban growth boundary is where your more urbanized things are. Right now, we can't completely say that because we've got hundreds of acres down there that have very suburban densities in what should, if it's outside the UGB, or would be a rural area. But the reality is the zoning doesn't match that. The county doesn't match that. So it's a little bit of a dichotomy. But, if that is a focus on James Island and makes them not happy with the plan, then we just don't do it. But as a purist believer in the urban growth boundary, I feel like it's something important to do.
Well, and I agree with you, Christopher. You and I have worked many years to support and defend that urban growth boundary. So I'm right there with you.
Christopher, I had a question. How is because we still have a good bit, especially James Island. I don't think so much West Ashley, but with the county, Charleston County, and some of them, their plans and things in coordination with what we're looking at.
So we have a very good working relationship with them. And of course, you all know the Folly Road overlay that we've adopted. And that's part of the reason for the thought about the UGB, because the Folly Road overlay allows, 8, 12 units an acre all along Folly Road. And yet we have it go outside the urban growth boundary. So, and that, the county doesn't have an urban growth boundary rural area on James Island. All of James Island is in the urban area in their plan. And it's been that way since, 5 or 6 years after the urban growth boundary was first developed in 99, 98, somewhere around in there. And the county switched it, and they've just never switched it back. But we have a very good working relationship with them. You all will be seeing at some point the Maybank overlay we've worked on with them. We've got regular dialogue. I mean, I probably talk to their planning director every week about something that's going on. So there's a huge amount of interaction.
Thank you, Chris. Other questions, comments of commission members?
Ms. Jacobs has her hand raised.
Donna, you go ahead.
Well, just to further this urban growth boundary just a little bit, Bill Moody introduced me to a word called congulium, which I don't even know what the definition is, but it might even go under that conundrum. Because if you look at these recommendations, like you should go to the high ground and develop and preserve the water and everything, if you look at some of those maps very carefully about where we should make sure our development is wise and dense, some of it is right at that urban growth boundary or outside of it where people would rather us not go and be conserved. So in some respects, we're creating that dichotomy that I just think we need to carefully look at those maps. And also, just like Mr. Lassane pointed out, the land is already being used that way there. I think they're just nervous that we might be recommending something in a backdoor fashion, and we just have to be very careful about how we introduce that to them and respect their thoughts on it. But I definitely think we need to have the discussion, because I'm looking at some of these maps and they almost conflict with each other in the sense that you recommend development here, but then that's not where you really want it or anybody wants it. So I just think we just need to be open about it with the community as we move forward with the plan, because it will help them understand why we're going to make decisions. And I think we'll make the wise decision if we have that good discussion about it.
Yeah, and I think, as we said, this is a work in progress and a lot of information to absorb. Other commission members, questions, comments?
Mr. Bailey has his hand up.
Chris. Go ahead, Mr. Bailey, you go ahead.
Hey, thank you. Due to the reschedule, I had to just listen to this while driving. So if you think it was a lot of information with the ability of looking at the slides, it's really a lot when you're only listening. So I look forward to seeing the slides later. The only comment, and maybe this is evident in some of the slides, but I think at the end of this process, one of the things that we should strive for is to make sure that any city resident, even if they don't like the answer, they can look at this document and get an understanding of where they should expect development to happen over the next decade. And I think that's what we hear a lot of people say, I had no idea. So if it's clear in some of these slides what the next 10 years of development will look like, then I think that will be one success of the plan. But again, I was really struggling with y'all trying to tell the difference in colors because I wasn't even looking at it.
It might have been easier without having to see those colors, because some of those colors are a little bit similar.
Mr. Bailey, it's good to have you, even if it's just by voice. It's good to have you here as well. But, and I think that's part of the transparency is the city reaching out and having meetings and as much information as Chloe mentioned about community outreach and in-reach. I think that's all good. Other commission members, questions, comments? Staff, is there anything else we need to present today?
This is what we had for you today. And, this is a lot of what we will be going out to the community with over the next 6 weeks. It'll get refined further, get the colors better, that kind of thing. And then ultimately we will have a full draft document that will incorporate, what we hear from the community on these items. And then that is what will come to you all for your recommendation, maybe late April or into May, and then on to City Council in May.
Thank you. Chloe, just remind us, when is the next meeting of planning commissioners on the city plan? I'm sorry.
I don't think we have one confirmed yet, because it will likely be in May. We'll wrap up with this next series of community meetings at the end of April. and we'll need to schedule something for May. And so Christopher and I will be contacting you all about that soon, but there is none scheduled at this point.
Okay, thank
Depending
you.
on how the
So if
community-
there's no more,
Go ahead.
go ahead, Chris.
I was just gonna say, depending on how.
Go
the
ahead, you go ahead.
We're going, if there aren't a lot of changes in the document, we might be able to get something to you, for you all to begin reviewing in late April, but, in all reality, it probably is into May before we can get the final written document to you for your review.
Well, it's a lot of information. You'll have to want to get it as right as possible, so we appreciate that. So if there's no other questions or comments from commission members, we'll go ahead and have this meeting stand adjourned. But I appreciate everyone's time and appreciate all the staff's work as well.
Here, here.
Thank you all.
All right,
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Christopher. Y'all did a great job.
Okay, thank you.
you.